Good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second session of the 18th MAP International CEO Web Conference 2020, A Whole New World, Reigniting the Stalled Global Economy. Our second session will talk about business in the new economic universe, rebuilding amidst changed global dynamics. And here to forge the way is the global leader for strategy and leadership of PwC. Please welcome Mr. BLAIR H. Sheppard.
I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you very much for having me. I hope we have an interesting conversation for the next little while. The story I am going to tell you actually begins 4 years ago, in 2016. We had, as you'd expected, built a strategy for the firm, and kind of uncreatively called Vision 2020 at the time. And we had built it on sort of some pretty serious trends that had been going on for a long time. And we had traveled around the world and come back and collectively said, it felt like the world's gotten pretty gritty. It's gotten pretty tough. And are these trends still relevant? So if I can move to the next slide. What we did, we have I have a few questions. The primary one being, what are you worried about? That we sort of asked in people in 60 countries around the world. So half of a significant portion of the people were sort of government leaders, a significant portion of the people were leaders of civil society, many of them clients like yourselves, and then we just talked to people in coffee shops and talked at the dinner table with people. And what we discovered is in every country in the world, the same 5 issues were being worried about at all levels of society, from government to business to individuals. You never get this except in circumstances of war or the events we've been going through for the last 6 months. And so we were struck by that, by the complete parallel across the world in terms of what we were worried about. They were worried about, and we coined the phrase adapt to summarize them. They were worried about disparity, which we capture with the word asymmetry between people, between regions, between generations. They were worried about the disruptive impact of technology on their lives and the environment. They were worried about polarization and its impact within society and between nations. And somehow they were worried about trust in leaders and trust in institutions that just weren't working. And in different countries, the relative age of the country would actually accelerate those problems. So in Germany, they're worried about, we feel like we're all getting old and we're ready to retire. Where in Nigeria, they were saying, where are the jobs going to be? Where's the education going to be? And so that age was seen as an accelerator of the other words. So as you would hope a firm like ours, an accounting firm in its origins would do, we went to say, are these worries real, right? And so if I could go to the next slide. What we did was we actually went to 14 different countries around the world and did a deep dive around each of those issues. And I have to tell you, I'm an optimist. I mean, I've spent my entire life sort of being optimistic about the future of the world through opening campuses in China that people thought would be impossible for a university like the Duke when I was a dean at Duke, at the Fuqua School at Duke, to doing all sorts of things where I just said, the world's going to be better, let's get it there. And we begrudgingly came to that there are 4 significant crises that the world has a decade to take care of, and if they don't, we're in serious trouble, right? So if we go to the next slide, let me describe the first of these crises. The challenge in part is, because of the disparity that exists in the world, as you look across the lifespan everywhere in the world, you have people who feel like their future is going to be worse than their current. So let's go to the aging population, people about to retire. If I give you US data as the starting point, it turns out there's 42% of Americans in private employment, not in the government, but in the private sector, who have less than $10,000 set aside for retirement. And the 42% are people between 55 and 65. So, and if you just $30,000 or $40,000, you capture 2/3 of the total American population who work in the private sector. that means a massive number of Americans are going to retire essentially bankrupt. Now, what we were thinking was this is probably an American phenomenon. So then we studied around the world, and what you'll see in the upper right-hand side is actually every country has people retiring with far fewer resources than you would expect for them to live through the rest of their lifespan. So we are essentially going to retire a host of people without sufficient resources for them to live a decent quality life. Now move all the way to the younger generation, and what you find is that actually they're graduating from high school or college or elementary school into a work environment where, except in the places where they've emerged from poverty, where actually the job prospects are worse than they were just a little while ago, where a lot of them have debt, significant debt, and a lot of that comes from actually having to live well. They're actually working their way through school. And where one of the things that people do to sort of accrue some sense of wealth in life is, so if you look at the graph on the upper left-hand side, what you'll see is that the cost of housing in most of the cities in the world, including Manila, far outstrip the ability of the median person to achieve it. So in 5 cities in China, cost of housing is 40 times median income. Now, a bank won't lend you money above 3, right? So we have the youngest population graduating into a world that looks not all that pretty. We have the oldest population in a circumstance where they're not going to be supported. And then, as you'll notice with the data from the Philippines, the people who are working and are most likely to be put out of work because of robots and AI are accumulating debt just to live. All right. So the issue here is, if I feel like my future is going to be worse than my current reality, the problem is I stop dreaming, I stop hoping, I stop imagining, I stop doing things. And so the consequence is we essentially think our way into a depression. Our sense is that if the world continues on the disparity path I just described, we have a decade before we're in real trouble. Now, the second challenge, we go to the next slide. Essentially, what's happened with the Industrial Revolution, and more recently with the technology revolution, is that we have created essentially a much better lifestyle for ourselves. We've created we've created things that are just unimaginable, but we've embedded them in our entire lives. And so, if you think about the challenge Professor Sachs described at the start of his talk, the environmental challenge, it's actually not just that we have to change our energy practices. We have to change every aspect of how we live. We have to change how we grow food. We have to change how we transport. We have to change how we build. We have to change how we manufacture. We even have to change how we take leisure, because essentially we've built the assumption of the industrial model into our lifestyle. And that model is based on carbon as a source of energy, as a primary source of energy. Now, it turns out if you take that same notion of sort of ubiquity, it's everywhere, and you apply it to platforms, the challenge with IT is when there's a problem with it, it's a population level problem. And so there's 3 examples that I've illustrated up here, right? The first example is that actually, if we accelerate at the pace we're accelerating technology, a massive number of people will lose jobs and have to transition to new forms of work. On the right-hand side, what you sort of see is that AI actually is this thing that we can really control. But the thing I want to highlight for everybody are actually the personal and societal consequences of platform technology. So it turns out, when I was a kid, if I died because I either had an accident or I caught a disease. The fastest growing cause of death among teenage males is now suicide. Now, girls don't commit suicide. What happens is they actually self-harm. But in both cases, it's a result of growing depression episodes and growing anxiety episodes, where the one thing that's really different between the world I lived and the world they live in is social media. Now, I promise the inventors of social media never meant to have that consequence. But it's a side effect, and because it's everywhere, it affects the entire population. Another really quick example is, turns out, because of the ubiquity of mobile telephones, our short-term memory is declining. Right? Now, the thing that you should worry about is the weakest part of the human brain, the part of the human brain which is actually not advanced from a chimpanzee, is our attention span and our short-term memory. So if I were to be kind of cute about it, we are now dumber than a chimp because of the phone we carry with us like this, right? Now, I promise that was never the intent of mobile telephone creators, but it's the consequence of ubiquity. The issue is AI and analytics and technology will be so pervasive in our lives in the next decade, it will be hard to unroot them, just the same way that getting carbon out of our environment today is really, really hard because it requires complete change in lifestyle. So now let's go to the third crisis. The next slide, please. The challenge with this is that actually, because of the first two, if I feel like my future is going to be worse than my current circumstance, and if I feel like the technology is somehow disadvantaging me, leaving me behind, I start to lose faith in institutions. And so what you see here is, for very different reasons, people uprising against the institution. I don't trust the leader was elected. I don't trust the system is taking over. I don't trust the police force. I don't trust the decisions you're taking within your country. Now, you could say, but Blair, those are just the people who are actually going on the streets. Well, here's the evidence. It's kind of troubling. So if you look at the Edelman survey related to the degree to which people trust institutions, we now have less than 20% of the world's population. This is a global survey of the world's population believing the system is working for them. And that number is shrinking every year, right? It used to be over 20, it's now down to 18%, and it's shrinking every year. And we have nearly half the population saying the system is working against me, and the rest saying, I'm just not sure. Now that's a really terrible circumstance to have, because the thing about institutions is they are for people what water is for fish. If we can't trust the legal system, if we can't trust the education system, we can't trust the political system, what happens is we just art is declining at a rate where we have a decade where we're really, really, really in trouble. Now let's go to the last challenge. The last challenge, which is, if you go to the next slide, the last challenge is really a challenge of leadership. And if we can move to the slide, please. And the point I want to highlight here is that think of the challenge the leaders have today. So the first thing is they have dramatically huge issues to deal with, if you think of things I just described. Second, they're dealing with societies that are increasingly polarized with a social system that's stopping them from being able to sort of get sides to agree with each other, and we don't trust them. Now, so essentially, our leaders are starting a step down. But the other point, which I think may be an even more important point, is they were prepared for a world we no longer live in. And so we can point to all the failures of leadership in the world. At some level, it's actually people trying to lead in a world that no longer exists. So that's the story that we drew, and then COVID hit. If we could move 2 slides, please. What happened when COVID hit is that actually at a societal level and a business level, we had massive damage in 3 profound ways, distinct from the virus itself, right? The first is that we created huge harm to the balance sheet of countries and to the balance sheets of companies. Now, it turns out maybe 15% of the companies in the world actually are better off as a result because they happen to be in the right sectors. But if you look across the vast majority of sectors, their balance sheets are really, really, really in trouble. Government balance sheets, same thing. We've had whole sectors that have been harmed. We've had customers that have been harmed. We have employees who have been left behind. And we have small business in serious trouble. So here's the problem we have. We have the issues I described earlier occurring at a time when actually we have a crisis on our hands and not really the attentional capacity nor the resources to deal with those issues. So what did COVID do to them? Let's go to the next slide if we could, please. What happened there is that essentially COVID has accelerated the challenges that I described in the first slide, adapt, or said differently, the crises are probably 7 or 8 years away, no longer 10 years away. So just a few examples. If you take disparity, if you take asymmetry, you take the crisis of prosperity, best guess is there's 120 million people who have been driven back into poverty as a result of COVID. And a lot of those people were just dropped off a cliff, essentially. Right? So we now have a circumstance where the world was beginning to emerge from poverty, and we've just shoved it straight back at a time when actually people who had invested in technology companies were getting massive returns at the same time. So the gap is growing, the gap across regions is growing, and the gap across generations is growing. Second thing, if I was worried about the ubiquity of technology, the technology being everywhere, we certainly accelerated the likelihood that occurred by actually having to go to formats like this to run this event instead of all of us flying to meet you in Manila. And for a while, I think we've actually benefited climate, but it turns out we are still increasing carbon dioxide equivalents in the atmosphere and have not shrunk, even with the reduction that we had. And I think that we've become incredibly sensitized to the effects, so climate will come back with a vengeance. And I think in many, many, many places in the world, we have reduced our trust in institutions and trust in leaders, and some have gone up. And finally, if you think about international relations, the drive to localize for national security and national resilience issues just increased polarization, and polarization increased within our own societies. So here's the problem we have. If we go to the next slide. Everyone in this meeting has a triple problem that they have to solve simultaneously. And one of the things you need to think about is that the skills we developed in people don't match doing these things all at the same time. So the first thing we have to do is we have to repair the damage of COVID. We've got to fix the balance sheet. We've got to figure out how to get national debt under control. And you think about the level of national debt, it is massively larger than what happened in the economic crisis in 2007, 2008. In most countries, it took them 10 years to recover from that. So we're talking about a decades-long repair problem. We have to get small business back up somehow. We have to get people back to work. And we have to restoke the domestic product of our nations, and then bring the people out of poverty as much as we can. So we've got to repair this. And at a corporate level, we've got to bring our employees back to work. We've got to get customers back on board. We've got to repair the supply chain. And we have to clearly fix our balance sheets. But the problem is the amount of attention that's going to take, and the difficulty of doing that is really, really, really hard. But I'm sorry to say, at exactly the same time, we're going to have to rethink our entire model for how we run the country and how we run business, because the forces I described are pressing on us at the pace that's really pretty remarkable. And therefore, we can't wait. We can't repair it, take the 2 or 3 years to get back up, and then say, let's rethink it. Because if you think about just the example of climate, we have to change every aspect of the value chain in our lives, which will require massive rethinking of every sector. It will require massive remaking of our lifestyles. They can all be way better, but massive rethinking. We have to do that rethinking. We have to put it largely in place, and we have to be mostly successful 10 years from now. We don't have to start. We have to be nearly done. If we don't start now, we have no chance of getting there. If we don't fix the institutions now, our public won't allow us to run them anymore. If we don't fix the disparity issue now, the depression will stop us from being able to do the repair. So every one of the issues I described as acute long-term challenges have to be solved simultaneously with repair. And then we have to actually completely reconfigure our business to deal with the consequences of both of those things occurring. Now, I promise you that I think I just described one of the most challenging leadership issues you'll ever see. And you're going to have to do that understanding a completely different technological base for how you run your business on a go-forward basis. God bless the person who chooses to be a leader today. In a sense, God bless all of you, because you have both the most interesting challenge, but actually one of the most difficult challenges we've ever seen. And we're asking you to lead, and we're going to have to ask you to lead in an entirely different way. So what does rethink look like? Let's put some meat on the bones around this issue of rethink. If we go to the next slide. So for business, it really means 5 things, right? The first one is, because of the pressing nature of climate, you're going to have to figure out how to get to net zero far faster than you thought you were going to. And you're going to have to mitigate the physical risks of climate, right? And it turns out they're coming faster than we thought. No one thought that the California forests were going to burn as fast as they did. And no one thought that actually in California they were going to be forced to shut down the utility plants because the specs did not assume it would be over 105 degrees a day for 3 days in a row. And you could say, well, Blair, that's a unique issue in California. Well, it turns out 6 months earlier, exactly the same thing happened in Brazil. And so what we're seeing is an accelerated rate of physical risk concern. In Southeast Asia, it's primarily water, but it's everything really, right? And so you're going to have to both get to net zero faster and navigate the risks for your business. The second thing is, because we've accelerated progress to platform technology, you're going to have to compete in a platform-based world. It doesn't mean you have to be one, but it means you have to be able to make money in a world where actually the ways in which we connect to people, we sell to people, we interact with people, we gather data from people is essentially on ubiquitous, very large-scale platforms. The third thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to figure out how to manage in a world where there is still significant global interdependence, but there's a much greater focus on doing things we need done locally, right? Now the reason for that is that, first of all, the world was already fracturing, as I articulated before, but actually it got accelerated because most nations discovered that they had significant national security risks. And because there is the risk of a challenge between the EU and China, or the US and China, or the EU and the US, or any number of nations having a challenge with each other, they're going to be forced to figure out what are the strategic things we need to do locally. And then finally, if you think about what I just described, that entails a massive reconfiguration of how people work, including dealing with the people that we're going to lay off as a result of all the things we just did. And then finally, what organizations are going to have to figure out how to do is report on those so you retain the permission to make the change, because remember, we don't trust institutions, we don't trust leaders anywhere near as much as we did a decade ago. So that's the organizational rethink. Let's do the societal one for a minute. And this is a good way to then go to question. We go to the next slide. If you go back and say, so where did all this come from, right? Essentially, it's a consequence of 70 years of success. So after the Second World War, the world kind of got together and agreed on 3 core assumptions about how we were going to build multilateral institutions, how we were going to build business, how we were going to learn to work together, right? And we integrated massive economies like China and India into that world partway through, on the understanding that they agreed to the same basic principles. Here's what they are. First, that globalization is inherently good. Second, that technology is inherently good. And third, that simple measures of success like GDP and shareholder value are the right way to measure how well those 2 things are doing. Now, it turns out those are really good measures if what you're trying to do is recover from a war, and what you're trying to do is integrate 3 billion people into your economy. The problem is they're incomplete. And because they're incomplete, when you apply them again and again and again and again over 70 years, they start to show their dark side. So for example, globalization, left to its own devices, when you focus on shareholder value, will result in regional disparity. When you layer in technology on top of that, and winner take all as a consequence of technology platforms, what happens is we concentrate wealth in individuals. And then finally, when capital is allocated against that, we accrue massive wealth in some groups, and the next generation is left behind. Now, it turns out if we had GDP, if we had a broader measure than GDP, we would have found those issues. But because we're focusing on GDP, we didn't see them until it was too late. If we had a more sophisticated sense of globalization, saying, well, actually, maybe we should start with thinking about building local strength first and then interdependence globally, we'd have been better off. And if we thought about technology and recognized that it actually has some side effects we never intended, we would have had a different circumstance. So what we need to do essentially is take the best of what got us here and then add some distinctive color to it that makes it a more sophisticated worldview. So let's go to the next slide. And we need to essentially say, it doesn't make sense to globalize unless we actually build local strength first. It doesn't make sense to measure narrowly unless we can include more inclusive and interdependent measures. And it doesn't make sense to drive technology mindlessly without considering its unintended consequences. And if we can do that, if we can build leaders who can lead that, we can get the world there. Now, here's the challenge. What I just described took 70 years to build the academic literature around. It took 70 years to build institutions around. It took 70 years to build whole government models around. It took 70 years to build business models and legal systems around. And we have a decade to change this. That's an unheard of rate of speed we have to make a change. And so there's some things we're just going to have to drive really, really, really quickly. So that's the rethink problem. Now let me leave you with, I hope, a sense of hope. If there's anything we learned from COVID, it's that we can do things massively and fast. And I think we need to take that opportunity, and what we need to do is say, there is a chance for us to leave the world much, 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 much better and have a pretty good living at the same time. And who in the world ever gets a chance to wake up and think about doing that? That's our opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Blair Shepherd. To moderate today's question and answer with Mr. Shepherd, please welcome the Managing Partner for Deals and Corporate Finance for Isla Filipina and Company, PwC Philippines, Ms. Mary Jade T. Rojas Divina Gracia.
Thank you so much, and good evening, Blair. That should be Isla Filipina and Company. Anyway, Blair, that was some thought-provoking presentation that we gave. But before we start, I just want to ask our audience that for this session, we'd like to encourage you to type in your questions through the Zoom chat box. And please put your complete name, because those whose questions will be selected will get a hard copy of Blair's newest book, 10 Years to Midnight, The 4 Urgent Global Crises and Their Strategic Solutions. So Blair, let me just start out by saying that these are serious issues that you've discussed, which will probably keep many of us awake at night. Let's elaborate more on the crisis of prosperity. For the first time ever in the United States, the 12 richest people have accumulated wealth of about $1 trillion. Now, I can't begin to imagine how much money that is, but you have that on one end, but on the other end, you also have 700 million people who are going hungry because of poverty.
Yes.
How can we close this colossal income disparity, and what is the role of business here? Well, most often, let's face it, the primary objective of business is to create shareholder value.
Yeah, I think the issue is that what's happened with platform technology is a phenomenon winner take all. It was actually a former colleague of mine at Duke, when I was at Duke, who first did this research. And the way to think about it, for those of you who are soccer fans, is that the lowest paid soccer player in a Premier League team is paid way, way more than the best player in a second division team, even though they're not very different in their skill base, right? So what happens with platform technology is small differences get accentuated. The other thing that happens is that wealth accrues to those who are technologically sophisticated and have capital. And so there's this really interesting thing, which is actually Apple last week was trading at a value that was larger than the entire FTSE 100 plus $500 billion. Now that is ridiculous accumulation of value to a single thing of a scale we've just never seen before, right? And so if you think about the 7 large platforms, they are concentrating wealth to a way we haven't seen, both between individuals and between companies and between regions. And so part of what we have to do is actually sort of invert the model and pose the question both to them and ourselves, what would it look like if we actually focused on creating thriving local communities first? And so here's the analogy. I used to swim in college. So what we're essentially having is a circumstance where we're going to have an Olympics, but there's only 2 or 3 people who are good enough to swim in it. There's only 7 companies that have this massive wealth associated with them. And so it turns out to be pretty boring Olympics. So if you say, how do you fix that? The answer is build local capability first, have good city championships, village championships, they become state or provincial, they become national, and then they become international. You start with local first and rethink the model. We have to do it really quickly.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Blair. And interestingly, actually, there's a question that was sent in by Sam Acosta here, which connects to what you just said. What can you say about the role of Infratec in fostering equitable and sustainable developments, especially in the grassroots communities? I think you've alluded to this a little bit when you talked about local first.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that actually you can take tech and flip it on its head, right? So for example, if we want to create energy systems that are really efficient, some of those are actually extremely local, right? Where you have local sources of supply and a local grid that takes care of things between themselves overnight, right? And tech can actually be moved that way. So essentially, it's essentially rethinking engineering and rethinking how we apply the outcome of technology to say, how do we do it locally? But you know, we can build houses way less expensively with 3D printers. We can do energy. We can take IT and actually use it to accelerate intertrade within a region or within a city or within a village, right? And so it just requires starting with a completely different mindset. It doesn't stop platforms from being there, but their job is to facilitate local success. A big rethink, though, by the way. I mean, I made it sound easy. It's a big rethink.
Yes, indeed. So let's talk about technology a little bit. And certainly, COVID has accelerated the shift to digital. But as I watch the Social Dilemma on Netflix, I can't help but ask, you know, if technology is deliberately being used to influence how we think and how we act. And if that is the case, what is the responsibility of business? Where do we draw the line as business leaders? And how do we actually get ourselves back on track with, you know, the positive side of technology?
It's a great question, Bob. It's a really good question. I always talk about the unintended consequences of technology. You just said, but Blair, there's some unintended consequences, right? So the way to think about it is there are 2 groups who control our information right now, right? One of them is government, and the other one is large platform companies, right? Both of them have incentives that aren't perfectly matched to our own, right? That in a sense, government's incentives in some ways is control, right? And the private sector's incentives is to maximize income to the firm. That's kind of why we have regulation, right? So what we need to do is create pretty sophisticated regulation to actually sort of navigate that incentive problem. I think the second thing we have to do is find ways to get the same information and capability into the hands of civil society, so there's kind of a counterweight to what's happening in those 2 other places, right? But it's going to require really sophisticated regulatory thinking And again, the point is we have all these models built on a view of what antitrust looks like, for example, historically. They don't apply in this world. And so we have to think differently about how we regulate. And we've got to get ourselves to school really, really fast.
How much intervention should government put in there, though? I mean, if to correct this, we need regulation, but at the same time, we want free enterprise, we want freedom of spread.
Yeah, so I think part of what we have to do is actually start with the shareholder, and it's beginning, by the way. One of the things that was really impressive, if you think about the amount of momentum that was happening toward ESG in the shareholder community before COVID happened. It was really taking momentum, and I think it will come back. And so at some level, the best form of regulation is self-regulation. So if we can do it ourselves, and I think the way to do that is to focus on educating the shareholder. And the argument basically is, if I'm right that every one of these is a crisis within a decade, it is in your self-interest as a shareholder to take care of them, because they'll undo the business system you make money from if you don't solve it, right? Climate's an existential crisis. If institutions don't work, business doesn't work. So in a sense, as a shareholder, it's in my interest to worry about them. And so I'd start there. And then what that does is it puts appropriate pressure on the business leader to say, build me sustainable success. Don't make decisions that feel good in the short term, but actually are going to hurt the world and yourself in the long term.
10 years is not a long time, BLAIR. It's pretty scary, and we're talking about massive issues here, and to address them, it will also require an equally massive effort.
Yeah.
And, as you pointed out earlier, they're all interrelated. We cannot address one in isolation. You've talked about what, certain lessons that we can take in dealing with COVID that we can apply here. Can you talk more about that, and how do we operationalize that, especially in the Philippines when, we're still in the upswing in terms of the number of COVID cases?
Yeah. So two lessons you can take from COVID, I think, that are kind of important. The first one is it's possible to do things massively and fast, right? No one, if I'd asked anyone listening to this, could you shut an entire economy down overnight? No one would have taken that bet, right? We shut an entire economy down overnight all over the world, right? We've accelerated the development of vaccines in a way that's unheard of, right? By parallel processing, actually building manufacturing ahead of the drug being approved. So we're learning to do things massively and fast. I think what we have to do is take lessons from that and say, what does it look like to drive change at a pace and scale we've never seen before? And let me give you an example of scale. A person in India who's thought a lot about the number of small businesses we need for India to emerge from this crisis says we need 10 million successful small businesses in the next decade. Almost anyone in the world will say that can't be done. Well, it has to be. So the first thing we have to do is accept that the assumptions we had about speed and scale are wrong. We have to get to whole new assumptions about speed and scale. The second thing I think is we have to sort of learn the lessons of the people who were effective leaders, right? So the effective leaders in this circumstance were able to reconcile things that were at odds with each other, paradoxical in a way, right? So they had to be humble enough to know they didn't really know what was going on and seek broad input. So the best leaders sought input from medical practitioners, from epidemiologists, from business, from economists, from leaders in civil society. And they brought it all together and say, what's the right approach here? It even included psychologists, right? What's the right approach here? And I promise when they got the answer, there's no obvious conclusion. But they had the courage, they had the heroism to decide because they knew it needed to happen. So what they were was humble heroes. Now, I just described a paradox, Jay, right? I mean, we're putting things together that don't belong together. The second example is that we needed people who were technically incredibly capable, but actually understood human systems. Now, the problem is most people who study EE or computer science don't study sociology, psychology, anthropology. The people who study humanities don't study EE or computer science. So we have people who don't have the mix of capabilities we need. But the best and the brightest, if you think about Angela Merkel, for example, in Europe, she was really technically sophisticated but understood the system. Same thing in Taiwan. Technically sophisticated, understood the system. And that's the kind of leader we need. So we need leaders who can reconcile paradox.
Talking about those two leaders, we have another question here, Blair. Which country, based on your assessment of how they have performed and showed up in the last decade, will have the greatest potential of making the shifts in repairing, rethinking, and reconfiguring?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I have to say I'm not all that optimistic. But let me describe two categories of country, right? Two categories of country. First one are countries that are mid-size and essentially can benefit by not being in the fight, right? So you could think of a place like Canada, which is adjacent to the United States, but actually isn't in the middle of the chaos, right? One of the things we saw in our CEO survey a year ago was that people were reducing the level of investment they're making in places like China and the US and Germany because they thought it was unsafe, right? So a place like Canada has a chance there. I think the second kind of country is one that's emerging, but can emerge into this generation's problem. And so there's several in Southeast Asia that have a chance, right? Including the one we're speaking to today, because essentially becoming the thing we need to be is an opportunity that's easier when you don't have all the stuff in place you have to tear apart first. So those are the two I would give the best shot to.
Great. How do we bring that all back to the Philippines? I mean, you know a bit about the Philippines and how polarized we can be, right? So how do we take what you saw as best practices in other countries and apply it here?
I mean, so first of all, I think there's a critical issue, which is I don't think this is going to be politician-led. I think it's going to be business-led, right? We need politicians and we need policy, but that just takes a long time to do, and it's really hard, especially in a polarized world, right? And so I think we're going to need business to take the lead. And we're going to have investors and business people step up and say, we've got to build a system that works, right? And then the second one is that you need to find a couple of things that the country can rally around, that they really care about. And I think actually there's a few that are obvious candidates. And then the final one I think is that you have real potential to play two things, which is focus on growing dynamic locally, but also be a place that feels safe for all sides to be doing business with, right? Because you sit juxtaposed and you're not in either's orbit, right? And so I think there's a chance to be a little like Canada, as I was describing Canada, be in the middle of it, and a little bit like I was describing in Southeast Asian economies, which is you're merging to something new. But it's going to require, I think, some very courageous leadership on the part of your best business leaders and your best politicians, and a real effort to coordinate together to create. And the thing I want to highlight is you don't have a choice, because you only have a decade and it goes really, really, really dark. So get to it.
Yeah, speaking of leaders, COVID is changing the world, and it's changing the way we work and the way we do business. Are we producing the right kind of leaders for the new world, especially when you mentioned earlier that technology is actually making us dumber than the chimpanzees? Is there actually hope for us here?
Yeah, so I think two things. I think the leaders who are presently in place need to be tremendously self-reflective and acknowledge where they need to grow. Right. That's a hard thing to do when you've been successful your entire life, but we all have to acknowledge that we're responsible for creating the world. So a quick quote, I had one of my sons, I was describing the book to him, and he said, "Dad, you're going to remember as the world's worst generation." Right. I don't want to be remembered that way, right? And so it's time for me to wake up and learn to lead differently. And then I think the second thing is that the younger generation grew up in this world, and they actually probably know how to lead. We got to give them more room to to lead. And so if we created a massive number of small businesses locally and we gave them rope to grow those businesses, so the Philippines is a young country, we gave them a chance, they'll probably find a way for us.
Thank you so much for that, Blair. On that positive note, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Blair Shepherd, Global Leader for Strategy and Leadership of PwC. We're going to put our hope on the young generation and the next generation, and hopefully corral technology so it doesn't damage them. Or together.
Yeah, I hope so, and good luck with it, and everyone please be safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Together, we now have the opportunity to rethink our strategy, reconfigure the way we do business in order for us to rebuild a better world. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blair Shepherd, and thank you as well to our moderator, Ms. Mary J. T. Rojas de Vinagracia from the Isla Lipana, PwC, Philippines.